Okay, happy Friday to all of you. I hope you are having a wonderful day and getting ready for Shabbat. And thanks for tuning in for another episode in our 50 questions about Jewish life and observance. Okay, again, happy Friday. Thank you for joining us. I hope you're having a wonderful day. And thank you for being a part of our 50 questions about Jewish life and observance. Why is this doing this to me? Sorry about that. Okay, I hope, sorry about that noise background. I think it's better now, so hope you can hear me. Please let me know if you hear me well, and if there's any noise background noise, or all is good. And Rifki, if you want to check, you can check if there's background noise. Okay? So the question we're going to be working with today is, why do some Jews wear old-fashioned clothes? Okay, so maybe you've been around some Hasidic communities, maybe you've been to Israel, and you've walked through what neighborhoods called Geula, or Mea She'arim, or maybe you've been to Borough Park, or Williamsburg, or other Hasidic communities, and you've seen Jews wearing clothes that are atypical for modern times. So what's up with that? Why don't they wear modern clothes? Okay, so that's the question we're going to deal with today. And just before we get started, just want to bring our usual daily plug for the Kabbalah class that's being offered through Judaic Studies at UCF. I will be teaching a fully online Kabbalah class. Course code JST3210. You can sign up on my web courses on my.ucf.edu and join our Kabbalah class. I think you'll enjoy it. It's a fully online class. It's not something you have to be anywhere for at a certain time. There's just modules that you're going to be able to go through at your own pace during the week, and you could be a part of the Kabbalah class, learn a lot about Jewish mysticism. Again, it's filling up. If you want to join, please join. It's at my.ucf.edu, and you can be a part of it. It's course code JST 3210. Now to dive into our question for today. Why do some Jews wear old-fashioned clothing? So they say a story about a older Jewish fellow. He was sitting on a plane, and as he's about to take off, someone sits down next to him and starts telling him in Yiddish, an older gentleman as well, saying, "I cannot believe how you dress. You're an embarrassment to Judaism. You think you're in the 1800s. No wonder why people hate us. No wonder why there are anti-Semites. You are the people that cause anti-Semitism to flourish by being so stuck in your old stubborn way." So this older Jewish gentleman looks at the fellow, and with a straight face, he says to him, "I'm sorry, sir. I don't know what language you're speaking. I only speak English." So he says, "Well," and he says, so he repeats himself in English, tells him how terrible it is that he dresses so archaically. So he says, "I don't know what you're talking about, sir. I'm not Jewish. I'm Amish." So he says, "Oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to offend you. I'm sorry for mixing your own business. It's so beautiful that even though the world is modernizing, you're able to stick to your old traditions and do things in the way that you feel like doing it and what your ancestors did. It's so beautiful and commendable." So the Jew turns to him and says, "I don't understand. Traditions of Amish are fine, but our own Jewish traditions you're berating?" listen to yourself speak. If tradition is fine and beautiful, and you're commending an Amish person for following and sticking to their ways, then same works for Judaism. So to get a little bit of perspective on Jewish dress and why some Jews dress maybe a little bit old-fashioned, what you might call 18th century style, let's look at it from a little bit of Eastern European history. There was a decree in the Russian Empire. This is before the Soviet Revolution. This is during the times of the Tsars. And the Russian Tsar, Tsar Nicholas I, enacted a series of initiatives during his reign, and he reigned from 1825 to 1855. And these initiatives were intended to try to get the Jews, the millions of Jews living in his control, in his empire, to get them to assimilate. And he enacted a number of decrees. One of them was forced conscription for Jewish children from a young age, and be in service for 25 years so they can eradicate any Jewish values and raise them as Russians. Another thing was about Jews not being able to own taverns in the rural communities, which is a big way how Jews made money and kept themselves out of the big cities and segregated, so to speak. And also the Jewish people were forced, or there was a fine, there was a rule that we'll call the clothing ban. And Jews, all Jews, except for senior rabbis, were obligated to give up their unique traditional dress. They had to dress like Russians or like Westerners. They couldn't dress uniquely Jewish. It was forbidden, and they were fined or punished, or to take clothing taken away and torn up in public spectacles to try to get the Jewish people to stop dressing differently. And this was specifically tied to the fact that they wanted the Jews to assimilate into Russian culture and stop being distinct and unique. So for men, this traditional dress consisted of a long black coat that reached to their ankles, and they would close the jacket or coat right over left with a belt or a buckle and not buttons. Pants were short and were tied with a lace under the knee. In summer times, men wore long white socks that went up to their knees. In winter, the pants hung lower and tucked into their shoes or boots. Shoes were without laces. Hats were not brimmed. It was kind of like a little hat that didn't have a brim without any projection over the forehead. And so on and so forth. They dressed uniquely. They just dressed differently than your typical person might. Women wore long-sleeved, low-hanging dresses, low-heeled leather shoes, an apron that reached from the waist to the ground. That was very common. And of course, married women wore different types of head coverings to cover their hair. So the new law called upon all Jews to dress in contemporary Western Russian attire. Jews who did not follow this law risked being fined and imprisoned. And there are many testimonials of the Tsar's police tearing down and shredding in public the clothing of Jews who dared to defy the government's orders and dress like a Jew either way. Why were these Jews wearing such distinct clothing in the first place? And why were so many of them defying the orders of how to dress, and even by the risk of being punished or ashamed, still be stubborn about dressing differently, dressing in a uniquely Jewish type of way? So, in prior centuries, in the past, rabbis debated whether the Jews were supposed to be distinguishing themselves in how they dressed. The Torah tells us that we should not walk in the manners of other nations, and that's something the Torah tells us. And the question becomes, this comes from the book of Leviticus, chapter 20, verse 23, and there's debate in Jewish law whether that means that you're not to dress like a non-Jew dresses, and we basically just wear a different type of clothing than typical people wear, or it means that something that's uniquely immodest or uniquely anti-Jewish, that a Jew cannot follow Gentile custom if it's associated with a superstition or immodesty. But if it's nothing to do with a superstition or immodesty, then a Jew can dress just like any other person might dress. Most of the Jews in Eastern Europe adopted the first view that it's a matter of, and even if it's not a matter of law, but even just as a matter of custom, that they would dress uniquely different and not dress like Gentiles at all, to make sure they looked very differently, to look distinctively Jewish. One reason for this view was preferred. One reason why this view was preferred to become how they lived life and how they followed, we'll understand by looking at one of the great rabbis, Rabbi Yehoshua Rokeach, the second Rebbe of the Belz Hasidic dynasty, what he writes about this. And what he writes about wearing clothing and why Jews must dress uniquely different is an interpretation on the story of Jacob and Esau. You see, Jacob ran away from his brother Esau because Esau wanted to kill him. And after 20 years of being in his uncle's house, Jacob decided it was time to go home. And when he came back home, on the way, Esau was coming across him to greet him, and they ended up meeting. The Torah tells us what was supposed to be a confrontation ended up becoming Esav ended up, even though he was very angry with him, ended up greeting Jacob very graciously. And he invites him to, the traditional understanding of the verse is that he invites him to join him and travel together and live together, and Jacob politely declines. So Rabbi Yehoshua Rokeach, the second Rebbe of the Belz Hasidic dynasty, actually looks at this story, and he explains it like this. Esau wanted Jacob to wear the same clothes as him. In all other matters, he agreed that Jacob should choose to be different. Jacob responded by pointing a fact out that children are tender. That comes from the story in Genesis chapter 33, verse 13. Jacob was saying, says Rabbi Yehoshua Rokeach, the Belzer Rebbe, that the children are tender. What does that mean? Jacob was saying that although he would not be influenced by sharing Esau's way of dress, his children would be influenced, and it would lead to assimilation. So what he says is that that's exactly what Jacob was telling Esau. Myself, I'm an older man. And therefore, if I dress like you, don't dress like you, won't have much effect on me. But my children that I'm raising, I want to raise them distinctively. I want to raise them different. I want to raise them with specific values. And if I have them dressed just like you do, then maybe your values will rub off on them and not mine. So according to the Belzer Rebbe, Yaakov feared that if he and his family resembled Esau's dress, his children's Jewish identity would erode. His message was, and this was also voiced and understood by many other Hasidic leaders at the time, that what we wear shapes our identity. Not only does it show us who we are, it actually reminds us, it doesn't just show others of who we are, but it actually reminds ourselves that we are unique, that we are different, and we should be behaving according to our values and not just looking around the world and taking other values, but trying to keep uniquely Jewish values. That clothing have a powerful effect on how we think and behave is also not just something that Hasidic Rebbes believed back in Europe in the 1800s, but something that I believe is proven by recent studies, as there's a study that's quoted in Forbes magazine, Forbes website, Forbes.com, on April 3rd, 2012. The article is called "What Your Clothes Say About You," and I'll read from you a piece of the article that they write. in the on the Forbes.com. I'll read you a piece of the article that's brought up there. A study this year from Northwestern University examined a concept called enclothed cognition. Researchers define in their report as the systematic influence that clothes have on the wearer's psychological processes, meaning what your clothes are saying about you, what your clothes are saying to you, not about you, and how they make you feel. The researchers distributed standard white lab coats to participants, telling some that it was a doctor's coat and telling the others that it was a painter's smock. All participants performed the same task, but those wearing a doctor's coat were more careful and attentive. Their actions were influenced by their clothing. Enclothed cognition gives scientific proof to the idea that you should dress not how you feel, but how you want to feel. The clothes you choose are sending a message to those around you, but also not only to those around you, but also to yourself. And this is kind of the concept that your clothes influence you, not just that makes others treat you a certain way. When you see somebody that's wearing a business suit or business attire or wearing something that says I'm important, you treat them more important. That's an outsider. But even just shaping the way you feel about yourself, even just the shaping of how you understand who you are is shaped by the clothing that you wear. So dress the way a doctor dresses, you will feel more like a doctor. Dress the way a Jew dresses, and you will behave more like a Jew. This is the argument that the Rebbe of Belz, Rabbi Yeshua Rokeach, and many other leaders at the time, that if we dress the same as non-Jews, our Jewish identity is inwardly perceived as well as outwardly shown, that our dress shows that we're inwardly and outwardly that we're different, will be diminished, and we will fail to think and act in a uniquely Jewish and different way. This concern was especially important for the impressionable young minds that parents and teachers were obligated to educate. They wanted, even by the risk of punishment, to remain true to their dress code, so to speak, and specifically dress differently, so that should be the effect, so to speak, that it has on their children and grandchildren. So that is the reason why many Jews till this day dress in distinctive clothing. They want to distinguish themselves in dress. They want to foster and preserve a strong Jewish identity in themselves and their families. And that might be by you dressing uniquely different, by wearing like Hasidic garb with a funny hat and long coat and a beard and etc. But they could also be even in a more subtle state, when you walk around with a kippah. Even if you're not a Hasidic Jew, but walking around with a kippah, walking around with tzitzit, it sends a message to those around you and reminds you yourself that you are Jewish, you are different, you have a certain set of morals and principles and a way of behaving that will guide you and make you act the way Judaism wants you to act. And just to summarize briefly, before we add one more point, is that there is a rabbinic dispute whether Jews must dress differently. The custom in Eastern Europe was to dress distinctively as a means of preserving Jewish identity, and they were willing to risk punishment and mockery just to keep their values strong. Okay? So that is kind of the first basic concept. But now I want to develop it one more step further and show you how this concept of staying power and remaining distinctively Jewish and reminding you and the way you dress influencing you is very, very powerful. And it's interesting that various Jewish communities responded differently to the laws in Russia. Many rabbis ruled that it was permissible to change clothing under the circumstances and said, don't worry about it. Go ahead, dress like everybody else dresses. There's no reason to risk being punished for some article of clothing. So there were a few, however, who encouraged disobedience, despite the fact that it would entail punishment. This might help give an explanation to the reality today. To bring out this point, I want to show you a fascinating Talmudic passage. I want to read to you a fascinating Talmudic passage that comes from a Talmud, Tractate Shabbat, page number 130, side A. And the Talmud tells us like this, and listen to this is fascinating. Any commandment for which our ancestors accepted martyrdom in face of oppressive regimes, that mitzvah is firmly adhered to in generations later. Examples for this include refusing idolatry and performing circumcision. And you see throughout all of history that Jews, when it came to worshiping idols, or when it came to not giving their children circumcisions, Jews always kept to it and always did it, even if they weren't so observant. They kept to those standards because it's something that their ancestors were willing to die for. And many throughout Jewish history, many Jews were actually killed and murdered for that exactly. And the Talmud continues. Any commandment for which our ancestors did not accept martyrdom in face of oppressive regimes, that mitzvah is feebly adhered to in generations later. And an example for that says the mitzvah of tefillin. So tefillin is a mitzvah that not necessarily did our ancestors die for, so to speak. And therefore we see that not necessarily do all Jews put on tefillin. There are many Jews that don't take tefillin very seriously. And the Talmud says that is because that is not a mitzvah that Jews were willing to sacrifice their very lives for. And this can be explained psychologically. When people risk their lives for a particular ideal, it becomes very powerful. They will obviously feel much more connected with that mitzvah, and they will transmit that mitzvah to their children in a much more powerful way. Your children watch you willing to die for something. Your children walk away feeling that that is very important, very powerful. Okay? And that mitzvah is something that the children want to keep generations later. Think of one of the most difficult mitzvahs that there are. When it comes to fasting in Yom Kippur, sitting in synagogue for hours and hours, you would think that that would be one of the least mitzvahs kept. But the contrary is true, because it's so important to so many of us and to our parents and grandparents to be in shul on Yom Kippur, to fast on Yom Kippur, that even though it's a complicated, difficult one and an uncomfortable mitzvah, Jews of later generations watch and they see. You know, my dad wasn't so observant. My bubby wasn't so observant. But when it came to Yom Kippur, she was there. And that leaves an impression. And that is why we can likely apply this concept to the subject we're talking to as well now. Is that if you look at the families that adhered and remained the most Jewish, it's these communities in Eastern Europe that were willing to sacrifice it all for the way they dressed. It was so important to them. They're the same ones that you're walking around in communities, America and Western culture all over the world, and they still look distinctly Jewish, and they still act distinctly Jewish. And children of other families that maybe took the warning of the Tsar and the rules and maybe were lax on their dress, perhaps members of those families are a little bit more lax with their Judaism overall. So that's the idea. So key points, just to wrap up the concept. The way we dress influences our thoughts and behaviors. Many Jews wear traditional clothes to foster and preserve a strong Jewish identity in themselves and their families, and we've brought also some scientific studies and research shown that the way we dress influences us, and that these staying power, and that this really brings staying power. When we're stubborn about something, it shows, it transmits to future generations, and we are different for it. Okay, so that is why there are some Jews that would like to keep dressing and only dressing in a specific way. No, it's not just you're saying because they are looking at black and white photos of their ancestors. No, you can see the way the long coats are, the way the pants work. And you go to Williamsburg, New York, or Borough Park, you'll see Jews walking around with the short pants and the socks rolled over their pants, or a specific type of shoes, or the women wearing a specific way. It's not just black and white. It's more than that. But that's cute. Good to see you, Alejandro. And thank you, Michelle and Moshe Ruvain and others for joining. Have a wonderful Shabbos. Paisley, good to see you. Lauren, good to see you. Many others that keep quiet and don't necessarily always write that you're watching. I hope you learned something today of why some Jews are stubborn and want to dress in old-fashioned ways. Please comment and let us know where you're watching from. Let us know that you're enjoying. Let it be a part of the conversation. And I don't think we'll be able to do on Sunday. I'll try if I can. But I'm going to be traveling back to home. So it might not be so easy. But the question that we're going to deal with on Sunday is, why would the Torah state, do not cook a kid in its mother's milk, if the intention, according to the Talmud, is a broader prohibition, right? The Torah wants to prohibit mixing milk and meat. And the Torah tells us, do not cook a kid in its mother's milk. So the question is, why give such a broad, do I just give such a unique statement, and why give such a statement that's ambiguous? Why can't you just say don't mix milk and meat? Thank you for being part of today's conversation. And just a plug to our story, to our annual raffle. There's 13 days left to our raffle, and we're still trying to meet our goal. We would love for you to be able to help us, be there for students, and be a part of the raffle. The raffle funds Jewish life on campus and really makes a big difference in Jewish student lives. We are trying to sell another 531 tickets, and we're actually trying to sell at least 31 more today before Shabbat to meet our weekly goal. Every week we have a goal. There's 13 days left, 531 tickets remaining. Every ticket goes to help Jewish life on campus. The prizes are great: $10,000, 2 tickets to Israel, $1,000, $540, $360. But the main prize is you win the ability to help Jewish life. You get a mitzvah of helping Jewish life on campus and making a difference for college students. So thank you. Please join it. You can get your tickets at jewishucf.com/raffle. jewishucf.com/raffle. Thank you so much. Thanks for being a part of it. Shabbat Shalom. And thank you also to the 272 donors that already participated in the raffle. Last year we had 491 donors. Let's see if we can get as many people involved this year. Have a wonderful day. It's starting to rain cats and dog here, so I got to get out of the